My name is Sarah Charlesworth. I'm Director of the Centre of People, Organisation and Work, and we are co-hosting this event tonight with the School of Management, where I also reside, and also with Monash Publishing. But I'd like to introduce our Head of School, Professor Pauline Stanton. Over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, on behalf of the School of Management and the Centre for People, Organisation and Work, I'm delighted to welcome everyone here tonight for the launch of the book Winning for Women by Iola Mathews. And I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. A few weeks ago, I attended a presentation here at RMIT where the speaker put up a slide of Oxford University. And he spoke about this great institution being a seat of learning for over 1,000 years. But you know, from an Indigenous perspective, where we meet today, not far from the banks of the Yarra River, has been a place of learning for over 40,000 years. Because it's here that the people of the Woiwurrung and the Bunurong language groups of the East St Kilda nations would meet, trade, share and develop knowledge, and celebrate. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we meet today. And indeed, all the traditional owners of where RMIT carries out its business across Australia and beyond, and their ancestors and leaders past, present, and emerging. So why do we acknowledge the traditional owners? Well, for those of us who are non-Indigenous, it's because we recognise the rich heritage that is part of who we are and who we want to be. And it helps us to understand and value the considerable history of this land and helps us to shape our future and make a difference. And speaking of making a difference, I think it is significant that we are launching Iola's book here today, because how Iola overcame many of the challenges that she faced, that she outlines in her story, reflect the values of RMIT. To do what Iola did, you need passion, you need courage, you need imagination, and you need to be agile in your thinking when things don't quite go your way. You need to be inclusive to take people with you. And you need to want to make an impact. You need to want to make a difference. One of the key areas of the work that we do in the School of Management and in the Centre for People, Organisation of Work at RMIT is in the area of diversity and inclusion. And the work of many of our leading academics focuses in this area. It focuses on action, helping to shape policy, and contribute to public discussion. And we're also the only school of management in Australia that has 3 Indigenous academics. Our Professor of Indigenous Business and Enterprise, Professor Mark Rose, claims that we are the only management in the school that can make this claim. I'm not sure about that, but I'm just happy to claim Australia. As a school, socially responsible management underpins everything that we do. This means understanding history, culture, and context. That's absolutely essential. It means that fairness and equity should underpin everything that we do. And it means that we value diversity and inclusion. And with over 5,000 students offshore and onshore, we have an enormous opportunity to influence the next generation. We can make a difference, and that's why we feel privileged to be able to host the launch of such an important book. And speaking of making a difference, I would like to introduce a woman who has spent her life making a difference. Sally McManus is the 10th elected ACTU secretary in the organisation's 90-year history, and the first woman to hold the position. Sally was previously an ACTU Vice President directing the ACTU's campaigns. And prior to joining the ACTU, Sally was the branch secretary and an organiser with the ASU in New South Wales and the ACTU for 22 years. During Sally's time as ACU secretary, their membership grew, and she led many successful campaigns, such as the Equal Pay campaign for community workers. I'd like to invite Sally to the podium to formally launch Iola's book. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and the people of the Kulin Nation. I'm really honoured to be invited to speak tonight to launch your book, Iola, your memoir, Winning for Women, because without the work that you did alongside many others, I don't think I would be the Secretary of the ACTU today. There certainly wouldn't be 2 women leading the ACTU today. As the first female industrial officer at the ACTU, Iola, alongside leaders like Bill Kelty and later on Jenny George, were part of a generation of leaders who made equality for women mainstream union business. Iola's story is one of achievement and persistence in fighting for the fair go for women. When Iola came to the ACTU just over 30 years ago, work was a very different place. In your book, she talks about being one of the first generation of women to, as you said, have it all, both career and family. Of course, some of us need to be reminded, but I know not everyone in this room, that back then it was legal to discriminate against women at work. Some employers refused to hire women altogether, and others wouldn't hire married women or women with children. And businesses routinely paid women less than men, and childcare was virtually unheard of. And it was this environment that you came to Bill Kelty's ACTU. Bill backed women when it wasn't so popular to do so. I guess as one of 4 children raised by a single mother working low-paid jobs, Bill understood how unfair things were for women at work, and he was committed to changing that. And working with Bill and Ann Summers and Susan Ryan and a whole generation of activists were determined to change the rules that held them back. Iola was part of the centre, right at the centre of reforms that made our work and our country fairer for women. You know what, I ran into Susan Ryan just 2 days ago in Sydney at an event, and we talked about your book and also about at the time and the 1970s as well. And she said that, you know what, Sally, we really believed that big things were possible. We just totally believed it, and we believed that big policy changes were possible. And you did it. You did make big change. You passed the Sex Discrimination Act, established a whole nationwide large-scale childcare industry, got the Hawke government to back a childcare model that made it possible for many women to work, made employers and unions take parental leave, childcare and equal pay seriously, and in doing so that changed our country. And I know that that wasn't easy. Just like people who fight for fairness today, mighty scare campaigns were mounted against them, and I really had to laugh at some of those scare campaigns when I read your book. When the Sex Discrimination Act was being discussed, Iola was accused of manufacturing a communist plot to break up marriages by requiring truck drivers to have female co-drivers. And when you were building Australia's childcare system, one member of the National Party said women should stay at home and children should not be raised in some socialised, Russianised type childcare minding centre set up at the factory door. So you think a lot's changed in 30 years, but some Liberal MPs, they're still at it, aren't they? Just this week, Scott Morrison's Education Minister, Dan Tiernan, called it childcare a communist plot. What a throwback, hey? If it wasn't bad enough, just yesterday, a Liberal Party candidate said the reason why women don't have equal pay is because we're not good with money. And we're not interested in business matters. Don't want to, worry our pretty little heads with things like that, obviously. So Iola beat back the sexists in the 1980s, and we'll beat them back today as well, because we have to. And while now we have more women than men on the ACTU executive, you'll be happy to know women are still paid 14% less than men in full-time work, and more than 30% less for total earnings. And we still retire with half as much superannuation. And while the ALP has achieved equal representation in some of its ranks through, some of the work that you and others in your generation did, it's not matched by the other side, where women are bullied, marginalised and excluded, and not for their views, but because they're women. Even when they're women of merit, just ask Julie Bishop. That's why only a third of our elected representatives are women. So we must continue to fight for equality through the federal election and of course beyond. Because every time we see the current unelected Prime Minister retreat to his man cave, as one commentator put it, working women lose. Scott Morrison thinks that he can win this election by wrestling sheep and posing on the back of utes and sinking beers for the cameras, but he's wrong. He thinks he can treat women in our country the way they are treated in his party, excluded, marginalised, less than equal, lacking in merit to hold leadership positions. The trade union movement in this country will always fight for equal pay. We will continue the equal pay struggle Iola was part of by demanding pay justice for feminised industries such as childcare workers. The announcement by Bill Shorten on the weekend to support fair pay for these workers is the next step in our unrelenting march for equality. It comes after community workers protested, struck and fought for equal pay, and these early childhood workers have also spent the last 6 years walking off the job and campaigning for equal pay. Iola was part of that march when it was even tougher, and the momentum that was started we continued to build. Unfortunately, as it was in the 1980s and the 1990s, 1970s, 1960s, people profit from these injustices, want to see the system stayed rigged against us. They want nothing to change. I've also had experience fighting these people. When I was the State Secretary of the ASU, we ran a case seeking equal pay for workers in the community sector, feminised, undervalued work that was undervalued because it was seen as women's work. It was only possible because of your work and Bill at your side that we were able to take the big step forward. The victory we had was a huge step, but it was a rare one. In fact, the only successful equal pay case in the last 30 years. The Commission has since overturned the important success we had in not needing a male comparator to set new rates, reverting our laws to the same principles that have held us back for 30 years. And this is why the case for the early childhood educators last year was rejected and why the laws on equal pay need to change. The Labor Party's announcement to fix this is part of the answer, along with reforming the work of the Fair Work Commission by establishing a pay equity panel. Another important step forward is 10 days paid family and domestic violence leave for all people, but especially women. The fact that the Morrison government thinks that in 2019, women escaping domestic violence should be forced to choose between their income and their safety is abhorrent. The ALP has committed to paying superannuation on parental leave and scrapping the $450 monthly minimum threshold for super payments. We know that the solutions to these injustices, and we know who will work for fairness and who is determined to stand in our way. And the voters, of course, are faced with a choice: a shouty preacher whose only answer to any inequality is to wait for wealth to trickle down, or people who believe in that action should be taken on gender equity for working women. The contrast really couldn't be starker. The relationship between organised labour and the ALP during the Accords gave us many vital steps towards equality. Now the same relationship has the potential to advance us in the cause of fairness, I guess, as Susan Ryan says, achieve really big things. Thank you for the honour of launching your book. It's an important part of our history, trade union movement history. It's also an important part of women's history in Australia, about the long march to equality, and we will continue in your footsteps. I do declare your book launched and would like you to come and speak.
Bit scary going up those steps for a minute there. I have a number of people to thank. I'll come back to Sally in a minute, but thank you, Sally, for launching the book. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Stanton and Professor Charlesworth and RMIT for this fabulous launch, which they are completely covering. They've been extremely generous. They've covered for the venue, the drinks, the security, everything to do with it, and I'm really very, very grateful. Professor Charlesworth, Sarah Charlesworth over here, is very modest and didn't want to be speaking tonight, but really this wouldn't be happening without Sarah. She has worked with unions since, I think, the 1980s when I was at the ACTU, and she was working with the Liquor Trades Union. Then she did a PhD and went into academia, and she still kept on working with unions, and at the moment she's working with United Voice on wages for aged care and disability, which we all hope will come sometime in the future after childcare workers get their just desserts. So thank you, Sarah, for making it possible. She also is co-coordinator of a wonderful organisation called the Work and Family Round Table, which consists of academics like her all around Australia who do research into these areas. And I talked to her when I was researching the book a year or so ago about that work, and that was when she said, could I do the launch when the book is ready at RMIT? And I very gratefully said, indeed you can. So thank you, Sarah and Professor Stanton and RMIT. Now I'd like to thank Sally McManus, who is something of a hero to the women's movement and I think Australians at large. Some of you... Some of you may not know, but Sally is a black belt in Kung Fu and Taekwondo. She also goes out on weekends watching birds and taking photographs. So she's a lover of nature as well as being pretty scary on a picket line. Now, when I look at Sally, I think back to 1984 when I first went to the ACTU. There was only one woman on this very big male-dominated executive, and that was Jenny George. And at Jenny's first meeting, Cliff Dolan, who was the president, said, welcome to the meeting, gentlemen. And Jenny George sort of quietly pointed out that she was there. And Cliff Dolan looked around the room and he said, well, I'd be hard-pressed to find one gentleman amongst us. Jenny, as you all know, went on with Bill Cultier's support to be the first woman elected an assistant secretary and then the first woman elected a president. And now we have this extraordinary situation where we have more women on the executive than men, a female secretary, a female president, Michelle O'Neill, and I still can't get my head around it, frankly, having been there in the days when it was incredibly male-dominated, and Bill Kelty will remember that, and he's here today. It was largely due to Bill that things changed because he took women onto the staff, he took women into positions of authority, he created affirmative action rule back in 1987 to put 3 women on the executive, and he put women into vice presidents' positions and eventually assistant secretaries and presidents. So everything that is in my book really is a tribute to Bill Kelty, what I did at the ACTU and many others as well, because he drove that forward. And in those days, of course, we had the Accord, so that Bill and Simon Crean, who was the president, were almost like extra members of the cabinet. He could ring up Bob Hawke or Paul Keating and get things happening for us, and we were very aware of that. As Sally said, she got the Sachs case up. She was the driving force behind that social and community services case, the only equal pay case in the last, I think, 30 years that has won. And she also lobbied Julia Gillard as Prime Minister to get $3 billion from the federal government to help pay for those wage increases. It's all very well to talk about wage increases for feminised industries, but somebody has to pay the bill. And in childcare, we don't want it to be the parents. So the recent announcement that Labor would give extra wages to childcare workers and foot the bill is quite extraordinary and very welcome. Now, I want to tell you something about a book that Sally has written. It's called On Fairness. I hope you can all see it. It's a little red book. If you go into a bookshop, you'll probably see it on the counter. It just came out recently. And it tells you something about Sally's background and also her belief in how we can make a fairer Australia. I recommend you all to read it. It's quite a terrific book. And I'll just give you a couple of statistics out of her book to tell you what she's on about. She points out that CEOs' salaries are now 78% more than the average income. 78%. One CEO recently was paid $13 million after he got fired. And over 700 of Australia's biggest companies paid no tax last year, not $1 of tax. So you'd have to accept it's an unfair system. Power and wealth are not distributed, and Sally's book, the Labor Party, the union movement, and all of us here would want that to change. So that's why we need a warrior like Sally running the trade union movement to work with, hopefully, a Labor government, as we did in the 80s, and make things moving again. So thank you, Sally. I'd also like to thank Monash University Publishing, Nathan Hollier here, the director, Sarah Cannon, who is the marketing manager, Duncan Farden, who has edited my book over and over and over again. Thank you all. And Sarah Cannon in particular I want to thank, because she is marketing about 10 books at the moment, but I reckon she's had to spend 90% of her time on mine. We've been emailing and texting and talking almost all day, and sometimes after hours, and every time something good happens she gets really excited, which is very nice. They're wonderful people to work with, and I highly recommend them if you're wanting to publish a book. I also want to thank a few people who helped with the first draft of my book, which was too long and needed to be banged into shape. In particular, Fiona Wood, who's a colleague of mine at Glenfern Writers Centre, Jenny Doran, my colleague I worked with at the ACTU and who also writes a very good blog, you should have a look for it. My family, Sean Mathews and Iola Mathews, who were terrific at going through the book line by line and helping me to bang it into shape. And last and most importantly, Race, my beloved husband of 46 years, nearly 47, who was very supportive of the book all the way through, and lately can be seen late at night banging away on Facebook, telling everybody to buy it. and he has 3,000 Facebook friends. So hopefully they will all buy it. And through him, they're sending me congratulations. I find it interesting that instead of emailing me, because I don't do Facebook, they talk to me through his Facebook thing. And also people have been emailing and texting, and it's a very exciting moment. It reminds me of when I had babies. Everybody wants to be nice. Everybody wants to congratulate you, and you're walking on air, really. You feel very blessed. So, very briefly, how did this book come about? When I was at the ACTU, we knew we were making history. It was the Labor government after a long time and the accord with the union movement. Bill Kelty used to tell us almost daily, we don't know how long Labor will be in, so we have to seize the moment and get things happening, and we did. So we knew it was making history, and I kept notes of everything that was going on. And when I left 10 years later, I asked somebody what happened to the archives, and I was told that one bloke sent some of it off to some obscure place in Canberra, and I had a feeling that my stuff wouldn't ever get there. Women's issues weren't regarded as important by everybody at the ACTU. And so one Sunday I came in and I just quietly removed it all and took it home and put it in the garage. And it sat there for about 25 years, until a few years ago when I thought I better do that before I lose my marbles and write it all down and keep a record and show young women that a lot has changed, even though sometimes they think it hasn't. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. There's an amazing array of people here. It's like an archaeological dig of my life. There's people here from when I was at the Age. I started there 50 years ago. One of my colleagues here tonight, I reminded him he gave me my start by helping me put me on the Bendigo by-election. There's people here from Women's Electoral Lobby, 1972, and then working with Well in the subsequent years. There's people here from my time at the ACTU, there's people here from my family and friends, and there's people here from Glenfern, the Writers Centre, where I go regularly, and other people also produce books and we help each other in St Kilda. So just finally, I want to say thanks to Readings for selling the book, and I have a couple of messages about the book. Now, first of all, many years ago I was reading a book called The End of Certainty by Paul Kelly. Older people here will remember that book. And I was telling a politician friend of ours that he ought to read the book. And he said, no, I'm not going to read it. I said, why not? He said, I looked in the index and I didn't like what he said about me, so I'm not going to read the book. Now, many of you in this audience are in the index, and I don't mind you looking, but I want you to buy the book. And the other thing is I'm throwing out a challenge, and that is when I published my last book in 2014, in Melbourne. It was called Checkered Lives. It was about my ancestors in South Australia who were pioneers, and I managed to track down a lot of descendants. So they came to the launch and they were buying 6 books at a time because they were giving them to their relatives, their sons and daughters and so on. And the following week, I became one of the bestsellers on Reading's book list. So I throw out the challenge to you tonight. Let's make us on the bestsellers list of Readings next week. Thank you very much.